In the suffocating dusk of August 1862, on the winding slopes of Valle do São Miguel, a secret began to fester that would unravel a household and echo beyond the cafezal into the town square. The air tasted of dust and roasted coffee, heavy with the smoke of kitchen fires and the metallic tang of adrenaline, while the horizon trembled with cicadas and the distant roll of a wagon. The Casa Grande rose white and austere above the senzala, its windows reflecting the last gold of the sun, and its eaves hiding footsteps that did not speak aloud. In the courtyard below, the rason was measured into clay bowls, hands were rough with harvest, and the feitor Joaquim Ferreira moved like a shadow that knew where pain should be placed. Isabella, a slave in the Azorian lineage, kept a letter folded into the hem of her shift as her breath narrowed and a cough shook her thin ribs. If this story grips your heart, like and subscribe so that these voices are not swallowed by time. It was in that tightening, that small concealment, that the world of Madame Helena Moraes began to tilt toward ruin, because what a dying slave hid was capable of naming visits, names, and a pattern of secrecy that the Casa Grande had treated as private property. The estate itself was a map of hierarchy that could be read by sight and sound. The cafezal ran like a sea of green to the river, each line of plants ordered and pruned, each plant feeding a market and a reputation. The feitoria sat open at the rear, where goods were weighed and ledgers were kept under the watchful eye of Coronel Augusto, who never let his boots touch the dirt without first checking his gloves. The senzala was a room of togetherness and sorrow, a place where stories circulated by the smell of cassava and the scrape of wooden spoons, and where the mucama Teresa and the mucamo Sebastián mended shirts and hearts with equal care. The Casa Grande had a polished corridor, a parlor with heavy curtains, and a table set with porcelain, where Helena presided with the patience learned from a lineage that had traded kindness for control. The feitor Joaquim managed time with a cane and a ledger, tightening days into quotas, while the padrasto Manuel, an absentee owner with an old mustache, delegated violence through men who smelled of rum. Sound was a ruler here. The clip of a boot meant inspection. The creak of a door signaled a change of mood. The quiet of a late supper announced that decisions were being made. Scent mapped fidelity. The perfume used by Madame Helena hid the smell of oil and late-night tobacco, while the open hearths in the senzala exhaled the honest odor of cooking and bodies laboring. There were small cruelties as well, an economy of humiliation performed daily and accepted as law. The padrino of the town, a lawyer named Antonio, took notes at church while giving counsel to the elite, and the priest Padre Luis prayed aloud for souls and for the debts of men. Isabella moved through those spaces with a look that held too much knowledge for her age. She had been born under the eaves of the senzala, a child of a woman who had spoken softly to saints as if to people, and the father sold when she was no more than teeth and laughter. Her childhood was a chorus of hands, palms calloused on coffee cherries, a lullaby of machetes and rain. She learned to count by sacks, to keep rhythm with the coffee threshers, and to hide small comforts for others. A stolen turnip, a turned back during a sharp order. In adolescence, she learned to read the faces of the house, to know when a look meant favor and when it meant calculation. The formation of her dignity had been carved by work and by a secret schooling under an older woman named Maria Benedita, who taught Isabella to fold words in her mind and to keep them safe like seeds. Trauma arrived as a pattern. The removal of friends to be sold, the beatings that arrived on market days, the way hunger could make a person smaller without breaking the brightness in their eyes. In the present, Isabella carried both memory and method. She held the latter against her ribs like a small animal, and though her body was failing, her mind was precise. She had seen things that others pretended to ignore, and she had learned that paper could become a witness where voices were denied. Her backstory owed its tone to a life of careful observation, to an interior schooling that turned fear into a ledger of human names and actions, and to a quiet fury that swelled behind each cough. Madame Helena Moraes had a different book of memories. She had been raised in a townhouse by a mother who measured smiles and taught etiquette as if it were law, a mother who died with a ledger of debts and a closet of secrets. Helena married into the valley because marriage was a contract and a currency. And she learned to manage accounts, to sign a name that could both soothe bankers and silence servants. In the beginning, there was a brittle tenderness, a belief that power might be softened by gentleness, that knights could be governed by taste rather than terror. But power, as she discovered, operates by erosion. Loss turned her careful control into a hunger for certainty. She hosted visits that were not recorded in any ledger, late guests conveyed in whispers, rooms airier than the rest with perfume and the hush of curtains. Her backstory drew a line from an anxious girl to a woman who understood that secrets could be capitalist capital, an asset to leverage and a burden to bury. In public, Helena kept her posture, the soft laugh that could cut into a neighbor's suggestion, the small charity that functioned as a veneer. In private, she visited places within the house where shame could be seen and managed, and those visits became the very things Isabella learned to map. Helena's formation was practical and pained, and in the end she was less a villain carved from malice than a figure shaped by the architecture of a society that bought both land and people. The day Isabella was pulled into the house, Grande came like a weather change. The sun had a flattened glare, and the air smelled of boiled beans and dust and sweat. She stood beneath a window where the curtains trembled with movement, and Madame Helena watched with an expression that mixed inspection and a private hunger. The first scene of transfer contained the town and the estate in microcosm, and it unfolded with voices like knives. "Bring her up," said Helena, voice low like a purse of coins. "She will tend the linens," said Joachim, with the precise cruelty of a man who measured worth by muscle. "I will not have any trouble," Helena added, as if reassurance were a commodity she could trade. Isabella answered once, a small, plain sentence, "I will do what is asked." "You will learn the order of the house," said Joachim, "and you will not speak of what you have seen," Helena instructed. "Who will guard the senzala now?" asked Teresa, worry pitched into a single syllable. "Manuel will take over the morning shift," Joachim replied. "And remember," Helena said softly, "obedience here is safety." "Safety for whom?" whispered Maria Benedita from the doorway, and the exchange broke into a different cadence. The dialogue stretched into corrections and promises, interruptions and understatements. 8 exchanges in all, each one revealing the balance of power and the cost of being seen. Sensory notes were everywhere. The scratch of cloth as Isabella's shift was adjusted, the warm smell of someone who had been running, the metallic taste of fear, the dull thud of a chest when a command was given, the glint of sunlight on the letter within her fold. The house altered its rhythms after that night. Helena's late visits increased and took a different quality, as if the walls themselves leaned to listen. Isabella's nights were measured by the sound of footsteps and by the perfume left in the pillows. The sensual detail of each forced encounter was narrated with restraint and moral clarity. Hands that lingered with the weight of ownership. A voice that rehearsed affection like a doctrine. A mattress that smelled of cedar and perfume and the faint salt of tears. The subplot of abuse and attempted possession unfolded with close dialogue exchanged in the dark, 8 to 10 times in scenes of confrontation and resignation. "Do you not know your place?" murmured Helena more than once, as if repeating a catechism. "I have no place to go," Isabella replied, voice brittle. "You will learn to like." This, Helena said, failing in kindness. I do not need to learn, Isabella whispered. It is for both our protections, Helena insisted. Protection that belongs to you alone, remarked Isabella, the words sharp as flint. The room smelled of wax and old books, of coffee breath in sleeping bodies, and the touch of clothes between them carried the imprint of a system that traded bodies for solace. Around them, the community in the senzala reacted in quiet ways. Joan, who sharpened knives, walked slower at dusk. The older Samuel hummed hymns. Maria Benedita brought extra water and a small bread. The sensory count in these scenes was dense. The dampness of a nightshirt, the whisper of sheets, the copper tag of fear, the bitter aftertaste of stale coffee, the tactile roughness of hands made raw by labor. At roughly 1/3 into this unfolding came the moment to ask you to reflect. If you felt the tightness of injustice here, leave a comment beginning with, I would try too, and tell us what you would do in Isabella's place. Your words help this community imagine other ways to resist, and they guide future stories of memory and justice. Now return with me, because the plan that would change the estate begins with a cigarette stub and a trust placed in a name. The ally emerged not as a soldier, but as a seam in the social fabric. Maria Benedita, ant-like and fierce, proposed a plan born of small economies. She had been a servant in another household, a woman whose backstory unfolded in village markets, where she learned to bargain and to bribe with grace. Her motives were personal: a son removed and sold, a daughter humiliated, and a faith in the small laws of community justice. She met with Manuel, who kept watch at dusk, with Joachim the Feitor, who could be bought or blackmailed, with Padre Luis, who could offer shelter beneath the sacrament, and with Manuel's cousin, Manuel Zeno, who knew paths to Quilombos. Each conversation was a thread. We need a paper that cannot be denied, Maria Benedita said, counting on the one hand. A cart of some sort, suggested Padre Luis, leaning close to the candle. No public embroglio, Manuel warned. We cannot set the town against us. We will not be loud, said Joachim, for reasons complex and not entirely pure. The alliance called for names to be spoken cheaply in public and for gold coins to be used in private. The subplot grew. The story required confusion and trust in equal measure. In these scenes the sensory impression was again thick. The smell of wax and oil on a pen, the dust motes in a lamplight, the taste of bitter coffee shared by conspirators, the creak of a pew as secrets were arranged, the soft, papery sigh as the letter was replaced and hidden. There were moments of tension that arrived like tidal surges. The first occurred when Isabella was discovered with a folded scrap. The confrontation was a tight 100 lines of dread. Joachim seized the hem, and his fingers found the paper. "What is this?" he demanded. "It is nothing," Isabella said, lungs burning. "You will tell me now," Joachim barked. "The mistress," she whispered. "You think I will believe you," said Joachim, and he looked to Helena, who stood at the doorway, pale and collected. "Do not make trouble," Helena said, more as a rebuke than a plea. In the split seconds that followed, Maria Benedita stepped forward and began to tell an invented tale of theft that shifted attention toward a missing spoon. Pain and memory braided in Isabella's chest. She remembered a childhood beating and decided to stay silent to preserve the larger plan. That moment of tone had to hold both fear and cunning, and it did, leaving the group trembling and docile in its wake. A second moment arrived during a midnight meeting at the river, where Manuel and Padre Luis conferred with a notary from town. The exchange was terse, flaring, full of risk. "Can you make it look genuine?" asked Padre Luis. "It will need a witness," said the notary. "Who will risk their name?" asked Manuel. The notary tapped his pen and tasted old wine. The scene smelled of mud and a reed bed, and it ended with a compromise and an ember of dread. The third moment of decision was the night of departure, when Isabella, cloaked in a shawl, stood at the palisade. The air was thick with the smell of the earth, the crackle of embers, the metallic glaze of fear.
She had a letter hidden, but she also had a boy in her arms who might be the child of another cruelty. She looked back at the house that had both sheltered and violated her. "Go," Maria Benedita urged. "Leave with hope," whispered Manuelzinho. "Will she be free?" Isabella breathed. "She will be free if the paper holds," Padre Luis said. And she stepped into the dark. The technical work that followed required process and patience. The Carta de Alforría had to be prepared in a way that matched registry formats of the county, with flourished signatures, the right dates, a notarized witness, and a plausible transaction of payment that explained the release. The notary smudged ink as part of a ritual that would later be read as legitimacy, while a backdated receipt for goods created a trail. This step involved careful copying, precise numerals in the margin, and a witness list that could be vouched by a church that preferred discretion. The brief technical description is practical and necessary because the law could be more binding than a promise. When the document went to the registry, the clerk folded it into a stack and added a stamp that smelled faintly of soap and mildew, making paper into proof. The revelation finally came days later in the plaza when a trader returned with a receipt and an astonishment that became rumor. The town talked in halves and gestures. The coronel demanded an explanation, and Padre Luis found himself in a pulpit explaining mercy. Helena's world collapsed in stages. First, her social standing shook when the news of secret visits leaked. Then, accusations circulated that she had used alforjas as bargaining chips in private deals. Finally, the physical evidence appeared. The folded letter, found where Isabella had left it under a loose floorboard in the house where even silence had its cracks. The confrontation between Helena and the other authorities was a long scene of legal language and moral accusation, with more than 8 exchanges. "You have no proof," Helena claimed at first. "We have here ink and witness," said Antonio the lawyer, and he tapped the paper like an accusation. "Madame," said Padre Luis, voice sharp, "you must answer." "I answered my conscience in private," Helena said, then faltered. The town counted its favors and recalculated its alliances. The social fabric that had made Helena untouchable frayed under gossip and ledger entries. Resolutions are never tidy. Helena lost much of her social currency, though she retained certain claims on land for legal reasons. Isabella was granted a Carta of Freedom, formalized in a registry that smelled of oil and dust. And a padrino, Antonio the lawyer, who had been moved by Padre Luis, stepped forward to assure the transaction. The child in Isabella's arms was taken, for a time, into the care of Maria Benedita, who raised him as if he were a reed of future possibility. Manuel and Manuelzinho carried word to a nearby quilombo, where others found refuge. Joaquim, the fetor, was dismissed but remained in the valley as a kind of pariah. Teresa and Sebastián kept working the land, but with a different light in their eyes. There were acts of restitution in small forms: a share of coffee, a public apology in the square by a man who had been paid to look away, a ledger corrected. The moral of the affair hung like a banner. Secrecy does not make innocence, and the bodies that were traded carried memory like weight. There were also processual notes that mattered. The registry required 2 witnesses and an attested signature, and the town clerk demanded a fee that had to be smuggled through a basket of goods to avoid scrutiny. Such mechanics, mundane yet decisive, determined whether paper could move a life. These technical details are short and precise because law is less romantic and more procedural. 1 month later, the estate hummed differently. A month of quiet consequences and small reorganizations showed the fracture lines. Helena maintained the house but spoke less in salons. Newsmen who visited wrote oblique notes and then left. Isabella, with a stamped carta in her hand, walked the market with a new gait, slower and measured. Maria Benedita arranged a small parcel of land entrusted to Isabella to plant beans, and Manuel received a note from friends in the quilombo offering seeds.
And labor. The community watched, and some celebrated quietly while others plotted retribution.
The baby slept under a simple roof and was taught a song that spoke of names and of freedom. 3 months after the letter surfaced, the legal repercussions expanded. An inquiry into the estate's ledgers revealed other irregularities. Coronel Augusto faced censure over unpaid dues, and the notary who had stamped the forged receipt was dismissed. Helena sued for defamation, and her suit became a seasonal scandal read in cafes and during Sunday walks. The town split into factions that traded allegiances like cards. Isabella had work and a claim on a small plot. She taught other women to read slivers of letters and to fold sentences into secret stores. The Quilombo received travelers from farther off who came with stories and small trades. The memory of the letter hardened into a kind of local legend. 6 months on, there was a more durable change. The plantation adjusted its labor arrangements in small ways to quiet the murmurs of outsiders. Some workers negotiated stipends and small freedoms, others left to join emerging communities. Isabella planted a row of beans and a sapling that would one day shade a little plot. The child grew remembering a woman with hands that moved like song. Helena's name carried an edge in town, and invitations thinned. The notary reappeared in another county, cautious and diminished. Padre Luis recorded the events in his parish book and crossed a line between doctrine and justice in a way that few clergy did. The legacy traveled beyond the legalities. People began to speak out in other places where power hid. A pattern had been exposed, and that exposure became a tool for others. In the end, the letter was both a relic and an instrument. Isabella died years later, surrounded by people who had been part of her survival. Maria Benedita, old and still fierce, tended the plot that would become a small garden of names. The memory of the Casagrande and the Senzala remained as geography and as warning. Power had been challenged, not by spectacle, but by small acts of care and by the courage to make private actions public. If this story moved you, subscribe so that these voices continue to be heard, and comment beginning with "I would try to tell us how you would have acted. The past keeps teaching, and the act of remembering is the first step toward justice.